or I'll be able to get some of the slides from our presenters, and then we'll put them on the TWALA website so people can see what they might have missed in other rooms. But now we're going to begin Penny's keynote workshop, and she'll be talking about inclusive teaching, addressing the needs of different students in the English lesson. And after the workshop, we'll have our raffle for the Cambridge materials, and then a few closing remarks. So Penny, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear and see you fine.
Great. Okay, so let me share the screen. Can you see that?
Looks perfect.
Looks perfect. Okay, let's go. So inclusive teaching, addressing the needs of different students in the English lesson. Before I start, there was a note in the chat box at the end of my previous session, which I didn't respond to, Sylvie's comment about cooperative versus competitive, and I totally agree with you, Sylvia. I also tend to go for cooperative, hence the emphasis on brainstorming type of and pass it round type of activities, which I suggested. And if competitive, then preferably team rather than individual. So just to comment on that and agree with it. Thanks for that comment, Sylvie. Okay, so inclusive teaching, addressing the needs of different students in the classroom. And I'm going to talk mainly about define the classes as heterogeneous rather than mixed ability or mixed level, because heterogeneous means of different kinds, and all classes basically are heterogeneous. A class of 2 is heterogeneous. Okay, the only class which is not heterogeneous is a class of 1. All classes are mixed, even if they are assumed to be grouped by ability or level. Some are more heterogeneous than others. And some problems which we come up against are, well, you can write them in your own problems in the chat box, and in parallel, I'll look at some of the ones which I'd suggest. But in your experience, what are the problems with trying to include everybody when they're all different? I would say that perhaps the key one is the problem of providing for learning for all. In my previous session, I emphasized that the main criterion for including activities in a lesson is how learning rich they are. And the point is, how can we provide for learning for all when they're all different, with different needs, different expectations, different levels, different motivations, and so on and so on. Okay, I haven't seen any more ideas, so I'll carry on with my own. Maintaining a supportive classroom climate for everybody, arousing and sustaining motivation when they have different areas of interest and things which will motivate them. Maintaining discipline. I don't know how many discipline problems you have in Japan. In Israel, it's quite a problem, and in many other countries. Some countries less. I remember giving a talk once in Russia, and I said, well, what about discipline problems? And they said, what's that? They have much more better controlled classrooms, it seems, in Russia than we do in other countries. Maintaining discipline then, adapting materials for the different levels of the students and different needs, different learning styles, choosing an appropriate pace or level which would be okay for some. Usually any pace you go at is going to be too fast for some and too slow for others, so it's a real problem. Reaching the individual, particularly when you have a large class. I don't know how big are your classes on the whole in your areas? Could you, or in your experience, can you put in numbers or somebody tell me? The chat box doesn't seem to be moving, so I'm not sure if it's working or not. Martin, can you tell me if the chat box is working?
Yes, should be working.
2 new messages. Okay, yes, I'm seeing now 5. Martin says 5 or 6. Wow, that's a really privileged situation. 20 to 30, 20, 30, 40. Czech Republic, Sylvie says up to 24. Yes, Europe is round about the 25 mark generally. Here it tends to be bigger. Jermaine says 30 to 40 students per elementary, yes. So the problems of a heterogeneous class are complicated and made much more difficult when you have a large as well as heterogeneous class. So reaching the individual is a real challenge. And finally, assessment. Now, assessment is the one topic I'm not going to be dealing with in this session, partly because I'm not very good at it. I'm not really an assessment person. I'm more of a teaching person. But this is not to say it's not an important aspect of teaching. Of course, it's important. It's just that I'm not an expert on it and not very good at it. And I won't be dealing with it in this particular session. I'll be talking about strategies, teaching procedures, which can address some problems of the heterogeneous class. So not assessment then, but on the other hand, I will be focusing on my main area of interest, which is providing for learning for all. And on that, I'll move on. Now, when I started preparing this session, the first thing I looked at was, can the literature help us? I went to books and I went to websites, and I found advice mainly on something called differentiated instruction. And the kinds of advice I found are these. Just have a glance through. And they're fairly taken from a particular article, but they're fairly typical of what you find. And quite frankly, they're not terribly helpful, most of them. I mean, number one, know learners' strengths and weaknesses in English. Yes, well, of course you need to know their strengths and weaknesses in any class. It's part of basic teaching. Make differentiation manageable for the teacher. I'll come back to that in a moment. Offer a choice of activities, number 8, to let students do the differentiating. Yes, but then you have to prepare a whole lot of extra activities, don't you? And the question is, do you have the time and do you have the activities available? Recognize that cognitive complexity is intertwined with language proficiency is a bit abstract for me. It doesn't really help very much. And in general, not terribly practical, these kinds of advice. I mean, some of them are wise and a lot of them are true, but they're not terribly helpful. And I'm looking for something helpful. And the key is that thing about manageable for the teacher. So you go to online and you say, what can I do about differentiated instruction? You get advice like, make available simplified versions of a text. Yes, well, who's going to make them? And how long do I have to make them? Where do I get them from? Use learning stations. I don't know how many of you have tried setting up learning stations, but it's very, very difficult, complicated, unless you have very small classes. Design differentiated tasks. Again, more work. Add glossaries of new words to text. Who has to do that? When do I prepare it? Provide individualized instruction for weaker learners. Again, a lot of these, the kinds of advice that you find on differentiated instruction imply an enormous amount of extra work and preparation for the teacher. And what I'm looking for, as I said, in Israel, I have between 25 and 30 students normally in a classroom, sometimes more, very rarely less. Teachers are teaching typically between 30 and 40 hours a week. And they just don't have time to do the kinds of things that you can see on your screen. So what I'm looking for my situation and for many of yours is some practical principles which will enable me to address some of the problems, maybe not solve them, but at least facilitate or make easier the process of reaching the individual, bringing about, making learning opportunities for everyone, and so on. And what I'll be looking at is some underlying principles implemented in practical activities. There'll be quite a lot of practical activities in this talk, as there was in my previous one. It's my main area of interest. And assuming little or no extra preparation time. Some of them do need some preparation, but not, I hope, exorbitant or impracticable. So the practical principles for which I'm going to suggest implementations are the following. Well, the first one is individualization, which means varying or enabling the students to address tasks at different levels. Personalization, which means addressing differences between the students, not at the level of speed or ability, but at the level of personality, background, personal tastes and preferences, experiences, and so on. So it's the whole person rather than just the learner. Collaboration, use of working together, something which I'll call open ending, which I'll explain when I get there, and core plus optional, again, I'll explain when I get there. So 5 important practical principles. Start off with individualization. And please feel free to write comments or questions in the chat box. I'll try and keep an eye on it as I'm going and respond as we carry on. So individualization means the adaptation of the task so that different students can all do it and succeed at different levels. I'm going to look first at teacher-led questioning. Let's imagine you have some kind of 10-item exercise. And what normally happens if you're administering this orally in the classroom is that the teacher identifies the question to be answered, very often reads it out or asks the student to read it out. Say, we'll start with question number 1. The teacher identifies the question to be answered. The students raise their hands to answer. The teacher nominates a particular student to answer. The student answers, and the teacher confirms, yes, you're right, or corrects, or possibly asks another student to answer, but anyway, gives feedback in some sort of way, and then moves on to the next question, and the whole process is repeated. And this is sort of ping pong interaction known in the literature as IRF. Initiation by the teacher, response by the student, feedback by the teacher, IRF or ping pong. Very, very common in classrooms for all subjects, not just English, all over the world, from Socrates till the modern times. But the trouble is that, of course, only one student at any one point is active. And there's no possibility of flexibility of answering at different levels or taking more time if you need it. So let's look at some possibilities of making this more flexible and opening it out to a wider range of students in the classroom. Okay, only one student activated at a time, and the students have no choice as regards order of questions. And some students are excluded from the process because they can't think quickly enough or they don't know the answers. Some students simply opt out. Let's look at a variation. Inclusive mode 1. Okay, let's say same set of questions, and I'm still doing it frontally, the teacher-led process. But what I say to the students is read through the questions quietly, and now you don't have to answer them all. I don't necessarily expect you to answer them all. So I'll give you a moment or two just to look through and think about them. Then choose any one you can answer. Raise your hand to answer that question. It doesn't need to be number 1 or 2, it could be number 10 if you like, or number 6. Raise your hand, and the teacher nominates a student to answer, and the student says, I'm going to answer question number 6, and they give the answer. And that immediately makes it a bit more flexible. There's more time. Students can choose which they answer instead of having to choose the one the teacher decided on. And they go for a question they can answer. So supposing there's a weak student who can't do most of the questions, but can do number 5, they can immediately go for number 5 and get priority on that instead of having to wait and compete with the rest of the class. Inclusive mode 2, and this is taking the process a little bit further. Again, read through the questions. Again, answer as many as you can in any order you like on paper. And again, I'm saying to them, you don't necessarily have to answer them all. I don't expect you to know them all. Do as many as you can in any order you like, with a partner or on your own. You have the choice of working on your own if you prefer, or with a partner if you prefer. You don't have to finish, as I say. And here's an example of, these are questions for you, not for your students. Okay, so read through them. Answer as many as you can. You can answer them, if you like, in the chat box or on a piece of paper. And choose whichever you like to answer and write in the answer. Okay, 1, you're guessing S. It isn't actually S, but someone else like to suggest. 2, criteria, quite right. It's E, right, Sylvie? Right. 6, not. You see someone jumping to 6 because that's a clear answer which they know, and you go straight to that, which is really what I want. 3, center. Yes, and so I'm going for 8, a word that looks like a working language but has a different meaning. Very nice. Okay, so you see what it feels like. It feels a lot, actually it's more fun, so really in a way going back to play, but much more flexible and available to students at different levels. So what I do then is put them up on the board and you check yourselves. So, okay, E was right, criteria is right, center. And the rest of them, I'm sure you know, and if you didn't know, this is your opportunity to find out. Okay, let's move on. Let's just summarize what we just did. The conventional ping pong, teacher determines how much time you have for each item. If it's more inclusive, you allow students to take the time they need. So they can take more time or less time for particular questions. Questions are done in an order decided by the teacher, as opposed to questions are done in order chosen by the students or by an individual student. Teacher implies students have to know all the questions. This is quite important. The message coming across is not, I expect you to know, and if you don't, you're not up to level. But it is, I don't expect you to know it all. The more you know, the better. You decide how much you do. And that implies this following session. Students are expected to do all the exercise. No, students are expected to do as much as they can. Students work individually. Each student raises their hand to answer a question, as opposed to students work individually or collaboratively. Here we have the choice again. Not you have to work in pairs, but you can work in pairs if you like, or you can work on your own if you like. Because one of the ways students vary in a heterogeneous class is that some genuinely prefer to work on their own and some genuinely prefer to collaborate, and there's no value particularly allotted to one or the other. It's simply a question of personal learning style. Student responses are checked by the teacher, normally top down, or more inclusive, students check their own answers and they just call the teacher if there's something which they don't understand or which they can suggest a different answer to. So this is quite a very basic and easy way of varying your question technique. No preparation required, just an awareness of the options available to me as a teacher, the way I present and administer a set of questions. Example 2 is a procedure called pass it round. And this does involve, or can involve, a preparation. I'll tell you how it might not in a moment. In this case, it's a worksheet which is prepared like this, with a whole lot of nouns, or nouns, adjectives. Actually, there's an adverb there as well, and a preposition, all sorts of words in short, but ones which have a clear opposite. And the instructions are, when they get, each of them gets one of these, fill in any 4 of the opposites to the words, any ones you like, and notice they were not numbered. You can do them in any order you like. Fill in any 4 of the opposites. When you finish, raise your hand with the paper, exchange it with anyone else who's raised their hand, read what they've filled in, and fill in another 4, raise your hand again, and so it goes on until someone says my paper's full. And then I say, okay, great, here's the answers, and I project or dictate the answers. And if there's any discussion, someone might say, well, I thought of another answer to this one. What do you think? For example, small says big, and one of the students says, well, I actually wrote large, and I say, that's fine. So we can discuss some of them, but basically it's a self-check. And then, yes, and it would be called a word association game as well. You could write associations, you could write collocations. You could, yes, online, you can't really do this, David, you're right, it's a face-to-face thing. It's not an online technique. Could be word associations, could be translations. I don't know how you feel about translation in Japan. We're fairly laid back about it in Israel, so I might ask them to translate into Hebrew, no problem. Or a collocation, what word might go with this, and so on. The advantages of this pass it round technique, and I recommend you try it in class, it's really cool, that students have a choice of which to do, rather like the previous procedure I showed. There's no number, so they choose where they start, and if there's a word they don't understand, they don't have to relate to it. Legitimizing of not knowing. If I didn't know one, that's not a disaster. I just do the ones I do know. And then when I get the next sheet, I might, from what my predecessor has filled in, I might be able to understand. In any case, the teacher's going to explain them at the end. I work at my own speed. So if someone else has finished and raised their hand with the paper already exchanged, I can carry on work, but it doesn't matter. In another 2 minutes, if I finish, that's fine. I'm not under any pressure. Success orientation, I can succeed, or I can succeed more, or I can learn from my colleagues. There's no possibility really of failing here. And it's collaboration, to come back to Sylvie's point, collaboration, not competition. We are helping each other to fill in the page and succeed. A variation, incidentally, just to look at the classroom organization of this, is instead of saying when you finish, raise your hands, when you've finished 4, raise your hands, another possibility is says 30 seconds, fill in as many as you can. So some will fill in 1, and some will fill in 3, and some will fill in 5, doesn't matter. At 3, you exchange. And that also means that at any one point, the students are, all students are occupied and on task. Again, students work at their own speed and level, everybody is included. Okay, yes. Namika, thank you for that comment. Yes, they will leave a page of questions blank because they are stuck on one problem. Yes, absolutely. And the same thing is with comprehension questions. I couldn't do comprehension question 1, so I just give up. And it's a pity, because there may be things later on which they can answer, and if you make it explicitly flexible, then they don't feel that if they failed with the first question, then they failed. They can move on and do as many as they can. Moving on to my next practical principle, which is personalization, adaptation of tasks to allow for personal responses, which is affirming the right to be different, valued, and allowing for contributions that reflect all sorts of aspects of my own self, relationships, experiences, opinions, and so on. So ones which are based on my favorite thing, again, anything which is based on expressing one's favorites, or anything which is based on remembering experiences, or expressing preferences and so on, agree, disagree. One very nice procedure, better for small, well, you could do it in a class of up to 30 actually, is a practice called mingling. I'll show you an example and explain what I mean. Again, it's a bit of preparation because you need to prepare this this worksheet, but it's not very much to do. And you say to the students, okay, if they're small enough, you can just say, your parents have said you can have any pet you like, which would you choose? And you have to choose one item from each column. So would you like a big white cat or a small brown pony? Expense, no object, there's no problem, you can have anything you like. If they're bigger children, if they're 15 or 16, you say, okay, imagine you are aged 7 and your parents said this, what would you choose? And they fill in, and then they get up from their places and walk around and talk to each other in English. Do you want a, whatever I've chosen? I chose a small white cat. So I say, do you want a small white cat? And my partner says, no, I want a big black dog or something. So we pass on. And the aim is to find a soulmate, someone who wants exactly the same as I do. And when you find someone, you see if you can join up together and see if you can find someone else. At a slightly higher level, the same sort of thing, mingling with teenagers, you can say, ask them to write down, one chore I hate doing is, I would love to go to, and face. Something that really irritates me is, and something that really irritates me. So that's a little bit of writing to start off with. As soon as they finish the writing, they get up and look for someone else who's also finished writing and see if they share one of these 3, or all of the 3, or 2 of the 3 preferences or opinions on the various topics. And again, they're trying to find a soulmate, but even if they don't find a soulmate, the exchange of information is interesting. So they talk to one person, they finished exchanging ideas, they break off, they meet someone else, exchange ideas, break off, meet someone else, and that is mingling. The big advantage of mingling is, of course, that all the students are active all the time, and expressing, in this case, we're talking about personalization, expressing their own particular preferences and opinions. So some ideas with regard to personalization. Collaboration, it means working together, specifically working together in order to get better joint results than they could on their own. And that's quite important because there are some activities where this is not true. I'll come on to that later. And we have to make sure that it is. It enables more students to be activated simultaneously and enables, obviously, peer support and peer teaching. It's not necessarily group work. There are 2 types of collaborative activities. The first task is full class sharing. I'll come to access in a moment. First of all, class brainstorm, so through chat box, so this can be done online or orally. how many things can you think of that? And so I gave some examples in the previous session. I'll give some more later on in this one. So class brainstorming, or pass it round. I just gave an example with the opposites idea. That is a collaborative activity, although it is not group work, it is full class passing it round. Online forums. If it's writing, then sharing online through wikis or through Padlet or any other types. I mean, you probably know better than I do the online tools that are available for sharing online, using WhatsApp even, or sharing through emails. All these can enable collaboration, learning from each other, helping each other. So that's full class sharing, and that's full class collaboration. Pair or group work collaboration. So first, obviously, any kind of pair or group work. I'll give some examples in a moment. And mingling, I've already given an example with the finding pairs, or a chore you don't like, finding someone else who doesn't like the same chore. Let's look at group work collaboration that allows for different levels. I said I would talk about this picture, remember, in the previous session? Say things about a picture, and this is a very simple activity, and you can use any picture really from your textbook or download it from Google or whatever. But here's a simple picture taken from one of my books. And the idea is this: put them into groups of 4, say, and say one of you is a secretary, and you have to write down just a tick. You don't have to write down the whole sentence, just a tick or a check for each sentence said by a member of the group. You have exactly 2 minutes, and I don't start until I say go, to say as many things as you can about the picture. And it can be for the weaker learners, it could just be a word or a phrase. For more advanced students, it can be a whole sentence. But for every contribution, the secretary notes a check. And then after the 2 minutes, you ask each group, how many checks do you have? And they may have 6, 7, 15, 20, depending on the level of the class. And then you give them another picture and say, see if you can break your record. And you'll be amazed. Here's the other picture. You'll be amazed how motivated they are to try to say lots and lots of things to try and break their previous record. It's a really good activity for elementary, lower, intermediate language learners. Very motivating. It's also a kind of game, like I was talking about in the previous session, because they're competing against a time limit. They're also incidentally competing against themselves, which is rather nicer than competing against someone else. Can I break my own previous record? Notice, first of all, it's easy, very easy for them to do, and any student can contribute at different levels. You can contribute at any level. It's a concerted effort, nice feeling of collaboration, helping each other, teamwork, and everyone is activated all the time. Prep for the ICAN grade 3 speaking. Yes, I don't know about that, but you do. Preschool students, yes, right. Yes, it would work well with preschool students, Martin. Pair group work. Note that, as I said before, not all tasks are appropriate for pair group work. Not so good is doing a grammar exercise or writing a sentence or paragraph, because if you set them in groups to do this, what normally happens is that one of them does all the work and the others just sit around, either not participating or minimally participating, or just responding passively. What you want is tasks where that involve recalling So for example, remember the task recall and share, where the second part of it is that they get together to see how if they can recall more items that were in the list of words, or pooling ideas or brainstorming, as in the picture exercise. Because in any normal situation, 3 people will recall or think of more ideas than will 2 or 1, regardless of what their level is. So it's really worth doing group work for tasks like this. My next practical principle was open-ending, designing or adapting questions so there are many possible right answers rather than the kinds of grammar and vocabulary exercises or comprehension questions which we have in our textbooks, which tend to be closed-ended, one right answer. And as soon as you have lots of right answers, you open up the possibilities to responses at different levels by different students. So more learners, first of all, more learners get to respond because you get more answers to any single question. And crucially, in this context, learners can respond at different levels, just to make it, and weaker, shy students can be helped by the earlier responses from other students. So just to clarify what I mean, here's a very simple grammar exercise. Jenny is a baby, Jenny can't ride a bicycle. That's closed-ended, is one right answer. Open-ended, to practice the same target structure, I would say Jenny is a baby, Jenny can't ride a bicycle, but she can smile, and then challenge them to tell me what else can't Jenny do. And they know that the sentence has to be with Jenny can something or Jenny can't something, and they end it with something according to their levels. So a less advanced student would say, Jenny can cry, or Jenny can eat, and a more advanced student might say something like Jenny can't open a bank account or something like that. But you've got a huge spectrum, a range of answers with one root question, which is, a lot of people say to me, well, open-ended is more difficult than closed-ended. It isn't necessarily. It's only more difficult if the vocabulary they're asked to use is too difficult for them. But in this case, they can add very simple vocabulary to the root sentence. Open-ended vocabulary practice. So you have, I'm just giving a set of lexical items for them to practice. So I've taken this from a text or from a theme or from a unit, or just that there are words they've learned recently which I want them to remember. And I asked them to make, instead of doing a structured gap fill or matching exercise, I asked them to create sentences which use any one of the words. And again, they can choose which word they want to do. You don't say, make a sentence with princess, make a sentence with umbrella. Choose any you like and make a sentence with it. The choice again. I might narrow this down a little bit, add a little bit of fun challenge by saying things like, make a sentence with any 2 of the items. This is slightly more challenging. Or make a true sentence about yourself, personalizing. Or make a false statement. This is sort of higher order thinking, still thinking about truth and falsity. Make a false statement about any of the items, a real, in the sense of in the real world, it's not true. Make up a story, including all the items, or add an adjective to any of the items there. And again, because these are open-ended, they're much easier for students to respond to at different levels. I said that most textbook exercises tend to be closed-ended. Here's a very simple example. I want to show you doing a very simple one, how we can, in fact, make a closed-ended into an open-ended exercise simply by deleting things. So she, and they have to say left. She left early. He, they have to say made. He made the cake. I sat there for 6 hours. The man read the book. But if you delete the end of the sentence, tell them ignore the end of the sentence, you have to use the past tense of the verb, but you can end the sentence any way you like. So it looks like this. She left, and they suggest she left the room, she left me, she left her husband, she left. More advanced students might say she left without talking, and so on. And the rest of them as well. Not only are they responding at different levels and able to make very simple sentences or more advanced sentences, but they're also getting extra practice in the target structure. So for the weaker students, they're actually getting a little more practice, which is very useful to them. Well, it's useful for them all, really. Another possibility is to delete the verb and just leave the rest of the sentence. And this is perhaps after you've done it the conventional way, then you say, okay, think of more past tenses you know, and it just ends up like this. So let's say the man the book. So it could be the man read the book, but it could be the man wrote the book, the man bought the book, the man saw the book, the man edited the book if it's a more advanced student, and so on. They can make lots of the man stole the book. Thank you, Namiko. One of the nice things about open-ended exercises is that the responses, because they're unpredictable, they're very often amusing, original, fun, dramatic, and they add interest to the exercise as a whole, besides providing richer practice. The principle is you have to be willing to mutilate the text, but willing to ignore the instructions given by the writer, willing to tell students to ignore or delete bits of sentences in order to open out and make them open-ended. So you might delete the option in parentheses, what I did in the example I just showed you, or you might delete the word bank in a gap fill, or you might delete the multiple choice options in a multiple choice exercise. Thank you, Dale, for that. Mutilated the book precisely. Or you might delete one of the columns of a matching exercise and ask them to invent their own matches. Other possibilities for open ending, creative thinking. How many ways can you think of? And I mentioned this also in the previous session, I think. How many ways can you think of to use an empty tin can, a pen, a piece of masking, adjective before noun? How many adjectives can you think of to describe a noun? How many nouns can you think of to describe by the adjective? Lateral thinking is just a little bit more complicated because it's thinking outside the box, so unexpected links or brainstorms, like, for example, think of 10 ways to compare a tree with a piece of spaghetti, or think of some ways in which a lesson is like a wedding. I did this with a class once and they looked at me as if I was crazy. I said, there aren't any ways, it's like a wedding. By the time we'd finished the lesson, they'd actually thought of 30 ways in which a lesson is like a wedding. So they need to think a little bit, but it stretches them, and they can respond at different levels, not only in language, but also cognitively. Interrogatives. Find 6 questions which the answer is. Instead of giving a question and ask them to find lots of answers, you give them the answer and ask them to find lots of questions, and so on. Here's some more on the, I'll just let you read these on your own. Unexpected, again, it's lateral thinking, it's unexpected brainstorms, but ones which are perhaps a little bit more challenging, amusing, and interesting to do and to share later in the class. Finally, my final practical principle is core plus optional, by which I mean the class is given a core task, which is compulsory and which is easily done by all. I know that everybody could do it, so it's very simple. But I also add an optional task, which can be done by some, those who have time or who are able or wish to. Keywords in the instructions are at least, okay, or do X and do Y if you have time. Let me give you an example at a very basic level. Here's the conventional one, right? Write the items in the appropriate column. You've probably seen exercises like this classifying at a fairly basic level. And what I'm suggesting is that instead of saying write the items in the appropriate column, which implies that they need to do them all and they should know them all and so on, you say find at least 3 things to put in each column, more if you can. And then they do as much as they can. And I know my class, I know they can all do at least 3, and some can do more. And those who finish, I say, okay, you've put them all in. Think of more words you know that would fit in any of the columns. Adapt other tasks by, again, this at least thing, an exercise, answer at least 4 of the questions, more if you can, or write at least 1 paragraph more if you can, read at least 1 page of your reader. These are the kinds of things which activate this strategy. In tests, and this is perhaps a little bit controversial, but it's how I do it. When I'm designing my own written tests, I design the basic test, which is compulsory and everybody has to do a grade out of, and gets a grade out of 100. So if they complete the compulsory part, they can pass with flying colors. But I add a final section which is optional, which will get them bonus points. So they can, in theory, get 110 or 120. Doesn't worry me. Let me give you an example just to finish off. This is, if you've heard this story before, I'm sorry, because I've used it a lot because it's such a lovely one. I did this test with a 6th grade, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, practicing past tenses. And most of the test was things like this, section A, and then the optional part, which they could do if they wanted but didn't have to, was finish the stories you like, but not the same way as usual. And one little girl wrote, the wolf went off through the forest and came to the grandmother's house. He knocked on the door and the grandmother said, come in. And the wolf went in. And the grandmother said, oh, it's you, my dear little wolf. I'm so happy. I thought it was that awful little Red Riding Hood. So sometimes you get some lovely responses from these open-ended core plus optional tasks, which are a bonus for the teachers, as well as being learning rich for the students. So references and further reading, which you'll be able to download later. And thank you for your attention and participation. And again, I've left a minute, but if you have time and you'd like to, please feel free to ask questions or make comments. And my email is there if you want to write to me afterwards with other comments or questions. Okay, back to you. I'll just stop my...
Thank you very much. Nice round of applause for Penny, everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, virtual applause. Thank you very much.
I feel like my head...
applause. I can't hear it, but I can see it. Thank you.
Well, I hope you can hear mine, at least.
Yes, thank you.
I feel like my head's spinning with so many ideas. I'm going to try in the classroom tomorrow. I am going to have to pick and choose which ones to use. But Martin,
well, there's no hurry.
Martin, I'll turn the floor over to you. I know we have a little bit of time for Q&A, maybe. If anyone has any questions, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to note, I'm really glad that this is being is recorded, because there was just so much there. Every slide, that's like I've got to go over it multiple times to even though I knew it was being recorded, I was like furiously taking notes here on it.
Yeah,
there's so much good stuff there. So thank you very much for that presentation. I think we do have some questions. Yes, David, I believe.
Yes, thank you for the excellent presentation. One of the things that I wrote in the chat is that one good, I think, rich area to explore to address the issues that you raise is cooperative learning, especially the cooperative learning structures developed by Kagan and also Slavin and Johnson, which I think address almost all of the issues that you brought up. I highly recommend them.
Yes, thank you for that, David. Yes, that's a good point. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think a lot of people are still digesting everything.
Yeah, also it's the end of the day. People are tired. Yeah.
Well, I will go ahead and stop the live stream now. Maybe that is scaring some people off too.